It's roundup time. 2024 is not entirely over yet, and brands have continued to release a whole lot of new watches. This is a roundup of some of the most notable releases, at least from my perspective, of the last couple of months of 2024. There probably are what feels like to be something like 1 million different variants of the Speedmasters. The first Omega in space is, funnily enough, not the flagship model. That would be the Speedmaster Professional. The first Omega in space and the regular Speedy share a lot of DNA. The core dial layout is essentially the same. You have the black tachymeter bezel. You've got the chronograph pushers, the 3861 manual wind movement, and a Hesalite-like, but actually sapphire, domed crystal. The key differences come down to a different bracelet, straighter lugs, an overall smaller form factor, and different hour, minute, and seconds hands. When you get a lot closer, there are a lot more differences down to stuff like the color of the dial, the length of the plots, photina. But those initial ones I mentioned are the ones that really stand out to you. To me, the watch comes across as smaller, of course, because it is smaller, but the case is sleeker. It's more lean than the regular Speedy case. Even though it has photina, the blue-black dial makes this watch actually, to me at least, feel more modern than the regular Speedmaster. It's got a much more formal look than the Speedmaster Professional. Now, who's this watch for? Obviously, it's for people who like the look of the watch, but that's, a given. More importantly, this is a watch that appeals to collectors of space and moon and Speedmasters. It could also be someone looking for a chronograph with a little bit more dressiness in a smaller package than the Moonwatch. The biggest weakness of this watch for me is the 19mm lug width, which is always a little bit of an annoyance. Obviously, it makes for a more balanced shape, but at the end of the day, 20mm is just more ubiquitous. The bracelet is good, but it's not the best in the business, and personally, I'm a little bit tired of photina. As for my verdict, there are the possible options. Buy it, shortlist it, think about it, or there are better options out there. I'm saying think about it. Pelagos FXD GMT. Another day, another Tudor, and another FXD. This time with a Meta-certified GMT movement in a 12.7mm case. It's the same 42mm form factor that the Marine Nationale and the Navy SEAL FXDs have. It's got 22mm of lug width. The fixed lugs are 52mm lug to lug. If you watch my channel regularly, you should know that I own the regular Navy SEAL FXD, and these are basically identical in terms of wearing experience, which comes down to overall size and proportions. The major difference is the photina markers, an orange GMT hand, plus the Pelagos GMT text also in that same orange. The included strap doesn't have the colored centerline that the two other FXDs have, which isn't a mistake, but to me it's just not super consistent. Who's this watch for? The FXD lineup is turning out to be like the really serious diver outdoor watch from Tudor. It's a bit of a big boy by today's standards with both the 42mm diameter and the 52mm lug to lug, but also because you do get a little bit of a added height from whatever NATO style strap you're forced to use. This FXD is just the GMT option, and I think this watch will appeal to people with an outdoor mindset. You don't necessarily have to be special forces or have the ability to skin a moose with a pocket knife, but this is the vibe that this watch gives off. It might also be for a small group of obsessive compulsive FXD collectors that want the entire lineup. But basically, you have a third option of military themed FXDs. The biggest weakness for me is the photina. If this had had the Navy SEAL colorway with the white on black, it would have been a smash hit for me. But I get why they didn't do that. This watch needed to be more visually distinct from the Navy SEAL FXD. As for the size, I like it, but it won't be for everybody. Verdict? It's another option with enough making it different to justify its existence, but it's nothing really groundbreaking. I would think about it. JLC Tribute Monoface Reverso. The Tribute Reverso, released a couple of months back, represents a course correction for JLC. In a lot of ways, it's just another Monoface. You know the form factor, you recognize the Dauphine hands, and either the pearly white or the sunray blue. The biggest difference is a different form factor with updated sizing at 40.1mm by 24.1mm. It's basically a more classic size that should make it more wearable for a lot more people. The price is still on the high side at $8,100, but it's lower than what has been their starting point for the last couple of years. They went too aggressively with the increases, and with this model, they're hitting a slightly better price point. I don't see a lot of Reversos in the wild, which is a shame because it is, in my eyes, one of, if not the best rectangular watches ever designed. This form factor is also incredibly wearable. Unfortunately, at $8,900, you have to care about the kind of work that goes into making this watch. It's still predominantly a mass-produced watch and not fully handmade. However, You get a movement that is shaped for the case, unlike the round movement in the Cubitus. The entire movement is finished to a very high degree. The case construction is ridiculously precise. Everything just fits. The leather is incredible. This watch is for a person that appreciates those kind of details. It sits just below where manufacturers start to do more craft, and it dips its toes in that kind of craft territory. You have to be a person that appreciates that and puts value into that. Weaknesses, JLC is still expensive. This is relatively speaking more reasonable, but you really have to appreciate the detail that went into the movement and the case. If there are any other weaknesses, it's because it's not a duo face, which I just love more, but they also tend to be bigger overall. If you're in the market for a dress watch or a rectangular watch, this is a clear shortlist option. I might have my timeline wrong, but for me, the original Divers 65 was a watch that for me was associated with the revival of the small skin diver form factor. The Diver 65 has been a hugely successful watch for Oris and has spawned multiple variants. Since that release, though, a lot of companies have surpassed Oris. With both the Black Bay 54 and the 58, you get better movements, better cases, better finishing, better bracelets, basically better on all fronts. The Divers date is basically Oris playing catch up. The watch has some aesthetic changes to it that make the watch come across as less retro and more modern. There's still domed glass, but the dial colorways are flatter and more neutral. There's no Fotina to be found, and it's a little bit smaller as well. The bracelet still has the rivets on the side, but now the rivet end links have received a high polish, also modernizing the watch. You get yourself a display case back and an easy exchange bracelet for $2,800. It's for the person that likes skin divers in the vein of the Black Bay or the numerous SLA or SJE models from Seiko, or in another price range, the Blancpain Bathyscaphe or the Glashütte CQ. It's also especially for the kind of person that doesn't want the watch to be too retro in terms of styling. The biggest weakness is that this watch is very much an iterative playing catch-up release that just hasn't caught enough up. The bracelet still is nowhere near anything you can get from a lot of micro brands. The movement is the same 41-hour movement as previously, and the pricing is cheaper than Tudor, but I don't really think it solves the challenge. My verdict is it's a nice watch, but there are better options out there in terms of value proposition. Tissot PRX Carbon. It's the PRX in carbon for around $1,000. That's $300-ish more than the regular mechanical PRX, and I'd say it's totally justified. Working with carbon adds cost and also poses some interesting engineering challenges. Doing threading on carbon is hard, so you often see an inner case in steel that houses the movement and dial. This makes for a slightly thicker watch, but the PRX was never really thick to begin with, so it really isn't a problem. Inside, you've got an improved Powermatic 80 movement. A lot of movements like the Powermatic are often available in different variants with differences down to the inclusion or exclusion of synthetic parts and different materials for key components like the hairspring. This model has the better hairspring. You want a cool watch that's a bit more rugged and less stressy than the regular PRX. This is a niche product for a different kind of PRX customer. You might be dreaming of a Zenith Defy. This one gets you very, very close for a whole lot less money. Legibility can be a little bit hit or miss depending on the light. That was my experience at least. The watch isn't black. It's more of a very, very dark gray, and the dial has that typical forged carbon pattern to it, which looks super cool, but in some situations, it just doesn't have the contrast you need. You're getting a lot of watch for your money, but blacked out watches aren't for everybody. If it is for you, then shortlist for sure. Hamilton Khaki Murph with the white dial. Swatch Group pretty much mismanages their high-end brands. Blancpain and Breguet are just walking watch zombies with no direction. At the other end of the spectrum, though, Swatch really knows what they're doing. Tissot, Longines, Hamilton, they consistently release good watches, and this watch is no exception. After the movie Interstellar, they made the Murph. Customers asked if they could make a smaller version of it, and they did. Then they asked if you could get a white dial version, and they made that as well. This is that watch. It's got a Powermatic 80 movement with 80 hours of power reserve. It's got 20 millimeters of lug width. It's got a white dial with off-white eggshell Fotina. This watch is for down-to-earth regular people who want a nice watch that can do everything. It can be dressy, it can be sporty, it can be retro, and it can be a field watch if you want it to be. It's more on the old school side, but this is as close to an unpretentious watch as you can get. The person who buys this should not be afraid of wearing suede, corduroy, or waxed cotton apparel. When it comes down to weaknesses, I don't really think there are any. I personally prefer the black model, but white is a cool option. Shortlist for sure. Cubitus. I did a whole video about this watch and its release. Since then, a friend of mine secured me a brief glimpse in the metal of the watch. It's square, it's 45 millimeters from 10 to 4, it's impeccably put together. Patek watches, whether you like it or not, especially the watches on the Nautilus architecture, wear incredibly well. The watch I've seen is the two-tone, which is also my favorite. Who's it for? It's for the first-time Patek buyer and rich people who want the newest cool thing. That's how Patek markets it, and that is what is turning out to be the reality of this watch. I told my friend quite frankly, I don't think it's a great watch. I'm still not a hater, but the 45 millimeters makes for a huge watch. It's got essentially the same lug to lug, but your entire wrist is all watch face. This is not a subtle watch in any way. And as I said in the other video, it's a lazy product. It's definitely not worth $40,000 from a manufacturing or craft perspective. My guess is it costs somewhere around $4,000 or $6,000 to make in the steel version. My verdict, there are better options out there from Patek, from AP, from Parmigiani, from Cartier, from Tissot. I usually allow myself to include one watch that I haven't had hands-on with. This time around, it's a watch that very few have had their hands on because the watch technically isn't for sale yet. It's the first of 3 new Polerouters from the revived Universal Geneve. There's no pricing, very little info about specs and sizing. All we have is 3 watches paying tribute to the original SAS Polerouters. Instinctively, I'm drawn to the gold Polerouter with the black dial. I'm not convinced about the bracelet on the blue dial version. The silver and white dial version is a bit bland for me, but the gold stands out. I have no clue until we know the pricing. My guess is Universal Geneve fanboys will be the first targeted customers when the new models make their way into stores in 2026. Could this be the watch that brings back dress watches? Maybe. Weaknesses, not for sale. The verdict, I'm shortlisting them on principle. These 3 watches might not even make it into the retail collection, but the important thing right now is that there's promise in this design. It's nothing revolutionary, but that's not what we're hoping for anyway. Nomos Tangente 2-date. Don't judge a book by its cover. Or rather, wait to try a watch before you pass judgment. I think a lot of people had a gut reaction to the Nomos Tangente 2-date. Why would anyone want a 2-date indicator watch? A lot of people, myself including, just instinctively thought this is a stupid idea. Well, it's not actually too bad. I own a regular Tangente, 38mm, blued hands. I've always loved the Tangente specifically. To me, it's the most Nomos of all Nomos watches. It's simple, but not like most other dress watches. It comes down to the font, the starkness of the dial, the angular lugs. It's a great watch. There are 2 versions of this 2-date model. They're both in 37.5 millimeters. One has a white dial with red textured date indicators, and the other one is a sunray blue dial. The date window's at 6 o'clock and the pointer type date sits on the fringes of the dial just as it does on the bigger and more expensive Tangente Neomatic. It's for the architect or the designer that dreams about cubism and Bauhaus designs and who wants an edgy dress watch and can't live without a date complication. As for weaknesses, it kind of depends. I vastly prefer the blue dial because the date complication is less noticeable. Unfortunately, the thing that makes me like it in terms of looks is what makes it bad in terms of legibility. The white version has red text and markers, so you instantly know what the date is. On the blue version, it's actually not instant read. I actually think the dual date idea is fun and quirky. It's redundant, but I think that's kind of the point. It's kind of an in-joke. I would have said think about it if the white version had had an ever so slightly smaller 6 o'clock date window with black numerals and also black markings for the date wheel. Since it's red, for me, it's a there are better options out there verdict. Specifically, I'd go for the regular no-date Tangente or the Neomatic. Apple Watch Series 10. I love tech, but I'd be a terrible tech reviewer. I don't have the patience to test a CPU on a controlled test bench with all variables being kept equal to ensure the most precise compatibility and comparability in all the given scenarios. The Apple Watch is the Apple Watch. It's the marquee smartwatch that can do most things reasonably well. It's got health monitoring, messaging, fitness tracking. It's got everything. The big change on this one is that you get a bigger screen, but a slightly less intrusive watch. There's also all sorts of tech, but for smartwatches, we are past the point where each annual upgrade is leaps and bounds better than the previous version. Battery life is largely the same, and it's a little bit faster and a little bit better in terms of monitoring features. Who's it for? I'd say if you're already locked into the Apple ecosystem, then this is likely a decent option. For me, with the thinner case, it's a relatively unassuming watch. I own the Apple Watch Ultra, which I basically only use when I'm at the gym to control podcasts and keep me connected for phone calls without having my phone on me. It gets me faster out of the door and through the workout. When you put the new 10 and the Apple Watch Ultra side by side now, the Ultra now just really communicates much more outdoor and rugged and functional, where the new watch, the Apple Watch, is very discreet and dainty. Well, it might not be dainty, but it's kind of sort of in that space, and it's become more so with the added thinness and the sort of less obtrusiveness. The biggest weakness, battery life on Apple Watches is terrible. I have Garmin's that last for weeks on end depending on which mode they're in. Apple scrape by with at best 1 day depending on your usage profile. There's a big difference between someone that barely uses this watch and just has it on their wrist versus a power user who is controlling music, sending quick texts, and has all notifications on and maxed out. As for the verdict, think about it, but if you want something good looking on a wrist, this is not it. If you have an Apple Watch that's 2 or 3 generations old and you're not unhappy with it, I wouldn't upgrade. 10 watches, all good. None this time around were instant buy watches, but definitely some interesting options. For those of you that have tried or bought any of these watches, drop a comment about your experience of them below as well. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe. Cheers.